Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. I am delighted to have back with us Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She is head of PERIL, who many of you know from following our interviews. And she also has a new book out called Man Up. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thanks so much for having me, Jen. It's great to be back.
You certainly have a timely book out. We have seen now two horrendous murders, the Charlie Kirk murder and the murder of individuals at an ICE facility in Dallas. What strikes you about the individuals who are accused of these, and how does this suggest a category perhaps of violent extremism that we really have not focused on before?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're seeing across both of those murders and some of the previous ones, even the most recent Minnesota school shooting, where you have the most common characteristic emerging is that these are extraordinarily online individuals who spend a ton of time in online gaming spaces and other communities that are forums set up around those kinds of online gaming worlds. And they are described by people who knew them as not having been very political, right? Like that they haven't had strong ideological views in the past, or that they were murky. And so I think that the ideological motive, we've already seen that for years, this kind of blurring and hybrid, or some call it salad bar, this idea of, because online worlds allow you to kind of choose your own adventure and piece pieces of ideology together. We had been seeing that for a while with people who were, the El Paso shooter, who was an eco-fascist and blended environmental ideas about climate change not leading to enough space with white supremacist ideas, because suddenly there's not enough space for white people. So you have to target immigrants. So we had already seen some of that happening as a result of the way that online worlds introduce people to ideas and piece them together. But this is something new. This is like where people are carving messages on bullets that are communications that are actually intended more for an online community back in the online world than they are for the public. And in fact, in the case of the Kirk assassination, that shooter really was amused by, and appeared to be amused by, the idea that adults in the media or law enforcement authorities would be reading these memes out loud, and he would get these phrases into mainstream media. And so he said, I'm going to laugh, I'm going to die of laughter, or whatever, if Fox News actually says this phrase out loud, referring to one of the memes. And so it's a kind of gamified part of, it's almost like the gaming continues into real life. So this huge desensitization of violence, terrible idea that level of violence is okay in any way, and a sort of attention-seeking valorization of something that is then communicated back to an online audience. He did say he was motivated by hate, by feeling like there was too much hate. But we don't really know much more about that, about why he targeted Kirk. What we do know is that his communication on some of this was actually more for an online audience than for a public one.
When we see these people who have lives that really are online, they become detached from the rest of the world, desensitized. Um, what is that process of getting absorbed in a fictional world?
Yeah.
How does that work mentally, and can we stop that? Can people intervene?
Yeah. I mean, there are several different components to it. One is, and online gaming, I mean, a third of the world plays video games, right? Like it's a affective and pro-social space for a lot of people that brings a lot of enjoyment and community and contentment. And so I don't want to demonize games themselves. They have been demonized in the past, going back to the Columbine shooting and the idea that video games somehow were to blame. And that's been widely disproven. Like the link between video game violence and offline violence has not ever proven out to be empirically true. But what we do see now, that games include these online community components, the in-game chats, the live communities, and the servers like at Discord or Steam or Twitch, these other kinds of platforms that set up ways to continue to find the same people back in conversation. So you're in conversation with a sort of loose affiliated network or community of people who you're gaming with on a regular basis. It's not just, two friends in a basement playing a game on Atari 64 or whatever. So those communities, one, you can kind of detach from reality, and they're becoming so realistic, right? So there's a way in which, if you're wearing, virtual reality glasses, for example, when you take them off, and I've done this, you can have a moment of sort of like disassociation, right? You're just like, your worlds have actually changed, they've shifted. So if you're spending so much time in these heavily online communities and then you shift to the real world, that can be, first of all, a kind of abrupt psychological moment. And these are also sometimes cases where they're spending time, we've seen with chatbots in the kind of parasocial relationships with artificial intelligence, or with influencers online who they think they are actually in relationship with, or in communities around that. So you can really see a disassociation from reality that's reflected in also a lack of connection that boys and young men in particular have to real human beings in real time. So I think one of the ways you can break out of that is trying to help sons and brothers and friends and others, spend more time with real people in real time, not on a screen, and engage in ways that keep them anchored in reality and in real connections with eye contact and with um, emotional, discussions about their lives that are not just always laden with irony and satire, and this whole idea of like being an edgelord, edgy meme-based countercultural communication style that can really make it hard to have real conversations with real people in person.
Now, your book is about extremism, violent extremism, looking at it through a misogynistic lens,
Yes.
which we really have not done before. And when you look at many of these shooters, many of them are young men between the
Yeah.
ages of about 18 and 30 or so. You can almost bank on it.
Yeah.
And that's become kind of like almost the expectation. What is going on?
Yeah, so 96 to 98% of mass shooters, depending on the database you look at, but basically almost everyone are men. And the vast majority of them have a history of some sort of domestic and intimate partner violence, plus stalking, harassment, rape threats, sexual assaults. And a lot of the times they're incubating in those kinds of spaces, even though their targets are different. And so this is one of the reasons why we overlook it. So when you look at the Uvalde, Texas shooter, for example, who targeted an elementary school with a horrific attack, he was spending a ton of time in online spaces making kidnapping and rape threats against teenage girls. So a very misogynistic kind of incubation there, which they never reported, notably, because they told a journalist it's just how online is, right? So that normalization of misogyny in online spaces also becomes this horrible kind of normalization of it, in ways that can prevent people from reporting or changing that. But then his target was someone else, right? And so we saw that with the Charleston shooter, who was targeting Black Americans in a church, and while he was attacking them, said, and I will not repeat it online, but he said something like, "I'm doing this because y'all are assaulting our women," right? Meaning, repeating false rape crime statistics, about Black men. And so you see that the gendered motivations, whether they are false motivations around the protection of white women, or they are incubation of, so almost like practicing of hateful ideas and actions in online spaces that then later escalate, or violence enacted against women and partners that later escalates. All of those things indicate that there are off ramps along the way to mass violence, to school shootings, to other harmful outcomes. If we recognize some of those warning signs that were gendered in an earlier time, we might be able to off ramp people earlier.
Now, one of the observations that you've made is how divorced young men and young women are from one another, that they really don't have a lot of real world contact. Um, why is that? How did that come to be? And what's the ramification of that?
Yeah, and I'm already working on a new book about this issue. So the next book will be really around the gender divides happening in young people's lives, and the ways that they're weaponized then by political opportunists, but also by profiteers online who are trying to get them to sign up for things to spark a gender war, to feel like there's, to profit from trying to divide the sexes more clearly online and then sell products to them to make them skinnier or stronger, boost up the muscular with, physique with testosterone and steroids, or, promote pro-anorexia content to girls. I mean, all of those things are very common now. And so one of the things we see is that the online lives of young men and young women are almost no overlap, right? They get very algorithmically divided content. I mean, we all do, right? I get a lot of dog videos in my, because I have dogs. You very quickly, your algorithms are so personalized, but gender is one of the major ways, gender and age, that those videos are personalized. And so they're living in completely different worlds in online streams of content. And then offline, friendships between young men and young women, girls and boys, are declining. And so they're still dating each other, but even that is much less than previous generations. There's less sex, there's less drinking. I mean, there's some of these things are good outcomes, but they're also outcomes that keep them divided and separate from the kind of fuller expression of human emotion and relationships than they could be having. And I think that's something that is then easily exploited and weaponized by far-right populist leaders, authoritarian leaders, who are kind of sparking gender wars and positioning gendered social changes as a real threat.
Now, PERIL specializes in fixing problems, not just identifying them. Talk a little bit about what are the things you are making available to schools, to parents, to other people in the community.
Yeah, I think the solutions that have been offered so far about the harmful content, both violent and gendered, that comes their way, solutions that are really promoted right now are the equivalent of the security-based approaches that we see in the terrorism world, right? Like build better fences, create cell phone bans. And, those things are important and they do save lives, I think. But what we're arguing in the lab and what we promote is a more educational media literacy preventative approach that's upstream. And in the case of this kind of gendered content, that means having real and open conversations in digital literacy classes, in health education classes about the gendered content that comes their way, including violent porn that is really seriously shaping behavioral outcomes in college, for example, among young men and young women, with choking behaviors now being reported by over half of college-age women, in an unwanted way, right? So there's all kinds of things that are happening from the consumption of violent gendered content that are changing behaviors, and having open conversations in structured ways that are not judgmental, that are led by curiosity, is really essential. So that's the first thing we advise. And the second thing is to really listen to kids and teenagers and adults about what they want. And that's my favorite thing to do, is talk to young adults about what they think adults should be doing. And they say much the same thing. What they want are spaces to have conversations about this without judgment, without the fear of having their phones taken away, without the kind of shame that might come from them having seen something that they think was maybe they shouldn't have seen, but it showed up in their algorithm and they saw it, and then they feel embarrassed or ashamed and they don't know where to go with that, right? So we saw this with kids who've accidentally seen in an algorithmic error that happened on February 26th that Meta apologized for, floods of violent content that day, that some of them thought was their own fault because they must have hovered over something to get that live stream suicide content or live stream murder content to come their way. Horrific gore that showed up that day. And it's not just an exception. I mean, it does happen more regularly than people think.
So where do we go from here, I guess, is the best question. If we left up to the politicians, and particularly the current regime, it would all be fed through a lens of political polarization and tribalism, and as an excuse to go after political enemies. That not only is dangerous from a First Amendment and constitutional viewpoint, but it really is not the problem. It is really missing the problem. How have other countries done a better job with this in terms of how they address young people and mental health issues and a variety of ways to intervene?
Yeah, there's so many ways that other countries invest in this that are better than what we do. And so there's a million different ways to start. One, there's more content moderation and fees assessed to violations of that, for example, in the European's Digital Safety Act, so that kids are seeing less of that content, or they should be seeing less of that content to begin with. But we also have resources like in Germany, across the country, there are mobile advisory labs that are on the ground in 50 cities to advise communities and the counties that surround them on these issues when they crop up. Just like a parent would have a resource for an eating disorder clinic, they have a resource for a clinic that is about conspiracy theories or harmful online content or rabbit holes their kids have gone down, to see what are the therapeutic options, who are the therapists who are trained to deal with this, what are the ways that I can talk to my kid that doesn't make them shut down, how can I have an open and non-judgmental conversation with my child or my partner or my neighbor or my colleague about these issues. And so, nobody is natural at this, right? There's no playbook on that we somehow missed on how to handle this among your peers or your children. They are learned skills. And, these are some of the things our lab is trying to do, is provide those skills and resources for free to people that we test with parents, how to recognize some of the warning signs for teachers. How can you intervene in the classroom in a way that is that helps equip kids with the tools to know how to think, not what to think, right? So we're not telling them what to think, but know how to be more skeptical of the content they encounter online and not get manipulated by it. So these are sort of basic media and digital literacy tools that aren't, revolutionary in any way, but they are so absent from our lives that we hope they can be accessible to everyone across the country before too long.
You've studied violent extremism all of your professional life.
Yeah.
It strikes me that this was an eye-opening experience for you, that it was fundamentally different than some of the other inquiries that you've done.
Yeah.
How was that, and how has that now kind of shaped your view on the larger issue of violent extremism?
Yeah, I think, I have interviewed men and boys who are in and around violent scenes my whole life, and I have always talked to them about issues of masculinity, which is interesting, specifically around how conceptions of brotherhood and belonging, loyalty, things like I'll always have your back, how those emotions, along with things like anger and rebellion and the sailor soldier troop, the desire to be a hero, all of those things have drawn them in or make extremist groups sometimes more appealing to them. So I've written a lot about those emotional impulses and how they relate to their own ideas of being a man. And one of the things my German interviewees told me, that they felt very compelled to, it is a German word called gewaltbereit that we don't have, which means ready to be violent. They have this sense that they have to be ready to be violent at any time in order to really be a man. And that is part of the subculture of their lives, to be ready to throw a punch, to be ready to stand up for your friend, or to attack someone who deserves to be attacked in their view. And so I had asked them that, and I had also written about women's views, but I had never asked them about their views toward women or their treatment of women. I mean, this sort of, or the LGBTQ community, this gender policing that can happen, even the way they police other boys to be a man, to not cry, to man up. And so once I started looking at that and realizing that had been my own blind spot, that the field had ignored it, the data is so clear that this plays a foundational role. And so, I wrote this book, and I opened it sort of with an apology to the field for overlooking it for so long, but also with a kind of plea, I guess, for everyone to see that if it's existing first in our everyday lives, that means we can intervene in our everyday lives. We don't just have to wait for a government or a tech company to offer us solutions. We can start to reduce the likelihood that we police each other's gendered behaviors or enact misogynistic actions in our own lives, over the dinner table, on the soccer field. And that will provably reduce the likelihood down the line, in a big upstream cultural way, of escalation to mass violence.
Well, the book is fascinating. It's called Man Up. And I have to say, it's refreshing on so many levels, not only because it gives you an entirely different perspective, but because of what you described, which is even professionals in whatever field you're in can have a light bulb go off and see the world in a different way. And I think that intellectual curiosity and openness is such a great example, whether you're in this field or not. It was one of the things I most appreciated about the book. So thank you for the work you do. Thank you for everything PERIL does. And
Thanks, Jen.
Best of luck with the book.
Yeah, thanks for always shining a light on it. We need you. So thank you.